There was a dinner party in a house near Evesham some years ago, when one of the guests noticed somebody moving behind her. She turned and caught the sight of a dark figure crossing the room. She could not see it particularly clearly, but there was something about its shape and clothing that made her think immediately of a monk. It continued across the room until it reached the wall, and then, rather than stopping or turning, it simply passed through it. Nobody else seems to have seen the figure, and there was no second appearance that evening. It was one of those brief experiences that leaves a witness with very little to work with afterwards. Something was there, she saw it, and then it was gone. Strangely, the monk wasn't the most interesting thing she saw that night. Sometime later, when the evening was being discussed again, the woman asked about the little boy who had been sitting beside the fireplace. Her question was met with confusion, because there hadn't been a little boy at the dinner. She was certain there had. She remembered a small child, dressed in shabby, old-fashioned clothes, sitting quietly near the fire. There was something about him that made her feel sorry for him, although she hadn't thought his presence unusual. She had simply assumed that he belonged to somebody else in the house, and carried on with her evening. Only afterwards did she discover that nobody else had seen him. There was one other detail which made the story rather more difficult to forget. The place beside the fireplace, where she remembered the child sitting, was already known for being unusually cold. It wasn't simply that the old house was drafty. People had noticed that particular patch of the room before. Whatever explanation there might have been for the cold, nobody could explain why a dinner guest had apparently seen a child sitting directly within it. The story says rather more about the ghosts of Evesham than the great medieval battle fought outside the town ever could. Evesham has one of the bloodiest episodes of 13th century England in its history, yet its most interesting ghosts seldom seem to be warriors wandering a battlefield. They are much quieter than that. They turn up in bedrooms and sitting rooms, occupy familiar chairs, and walk across floors when everybody else has gone home. They are often encountered not by people searching for the supernatural, but by people who have simply looked in the wrong direction at the right moment. One woman entered a bedroom in an Evesham house and found somebody already there. The figure appeared to be a young woman, grey and partly transparent. But the peculiar thing was where she was standing. She wasn't beside the bed or at the bedroom door. She was standing on the bed itself. There was no conversation and apparently no attempt by the figure to communicate. The witness saw her, realised that what she was looking at could not easily be explained, and then the apparition disappeared. She never saw the young woman again. The story might have ended there had another member of the family not developed an unexplained dislike of the same bedroom. Apparently, unaware of the earlier sighting, she became uncomfortable with a particular part of the bed and preferred to sleep away from it because she felt there was something there. It proves nothing, of course. People become uncomfortable in rooms for all sorts of reasons, particularly in old houses. But discovering afterwards that somebody else once walked into that room and saw a transparent woman standing on the bed would probably make it rather more difficult to dismiss the feeling. Another Evesham household seems to have had a rather more settled visitor. An elderly man was seen often enough that the family eventually gave him a name, George. Whether anybody ever established that George really was his name is another matter. There doesn't appear to have been the wonderfully convenient discovery of an old photograph identifying him as previous occupant. He was simply an elderly figure who sometimes appeared sitting in a chair, as though he still considered it his. Perhaps the most peculiar thing about George is how quickly something impossible seems to have become part of the household. A stranger sitting in your home should be alarming. A dead stranger ought to be considerably worse. Yet after enough appearances, apparently even a ghost can become familiar. The Royal Oak on Vine Street has a similar story, although its resident apparition seems to have found something to occupy herself. An elderly woman has reportedly been seen sitting in one of the bedrooms knitting. There is no great tragedy attached to the scene, and no apparent attempt to frighten whoever she sees. She simply sits there, doing something she may have done hundreds of evenings while she was alive. There is something rather gentle about the story, until you imagine opening a bedroom door and finding an old woman quietly knitting in a room you know should be empty. Not everything reported at the Royal Oak has been quite so peaceful. One of its more unsettling stories comes from the cellar, where a man became aware of something close to him, and then felt what he believed was physical contact. Something seemed to press or push against his body before moving away. A moment later, he heard footsteps crossing the cellar. He listened as they travelled toward one of the walls, and expected them to stop when they reached it. They didn't. The footsteps apparently continued beyond the wall, as though whoever was making them was following a passage through the building that no longer existed. That possibility is perhaps more interesting than any elaborate explanation involving a named ghost. Old buildings change, doorways are blocked, rooms divided and passages filled in, until the people occupying them have little idea how somebody centuries earlier would have moved through the same space. If the account from the Royal Oak is taken at face value, whatever crossed that cellar may simply have been walking through a version of the building different from the one occupied by the witness. It wouldn't be the only place in Evesham where people have heard somebody apparently continuing with an ordinary journey after the physical surroundings have changed. Roger Evans encountered something similar while working at Clare Barry on Evesham High Street, in premises formerly occupied by Angel Meats. He was preparing to leave one evening and believed he was alone in the building when he heard somebody moving upstairs. What frightened him was the familiarity of the sound. It didn't strike him as the vague groaning of an old building or the knock of heating pipes. Somebody appeared to be walking across the floor above his head. Roger later admitted that he had no desire to go upstairs and discover who was there. He then learned that the neighbouring premises had stories of their own. Staff in the shop next door, at one time priceless shoes, had also spoken about unexplained activity, including footsteps when parts of the building should have been empty. It was inevitable that people would eventually try to connect these experiences with the history of this part of Evesham, because during the 17th century, Quakers were persecuted and imprisoned in the town. Accounts of their treatment describe miserable conditions, and local tradition came to associate old places of confinement within buildings around this area. It would make a wonderfully complete ghost story if we could say that the person walking above Roger Evans was one of those prisoners. We can't. He saw nobody, and footsteps don't tell us what century the person making them belongs to. But I don't think the story needs the explanation. A man finishing work alone in an apparently empty shop hears somebody walking around on the floor above him. He knows there shouldn't be anybody there and decides he doesn't particularly want to go meet them. Sometimes a ghost story becomes weaker when we try too hard to explain the ghost. Not too far away, another piece of Evesham's past lies beneath one of its pubs. The Valkyrie Bar occupies premises beneath the town hall. Above space is traditionally associated with former holding cells. The people who work there speak about the possibility of ghosts without much ceremony. One of the owners has described glasses coming from shelves when nobody appeared to have disturbed them, and other objects being found somewhere other than expected. None of that is spectacular in isolation, particularly in a busy pub where things are constantly being moved. But the stories become more interesting after closing time, when the noise above the old cells finally stops. The thought of those cells is more effective than any attempt to populate them with invented prisoners. People once waited beneath the town under circumstances very different from those of the customers drinking above them today. The old spaces have since been closed or concreted over, leaving the modern bar separated from them by little more than floors, stone and time. Whether anything remains down there is impossible to know, but when a glass falls unexpectedly from a shelf in a building already carrying that history, it is understandable that the people working there occasionally wonder. There is another cellar in Evesham where wondering about ghosts has become almost the purpose of going inside. The Spirit House. The Spirit House has acquired a substantial paranormal reputation in recent years, and visitors now arrive knowing exactly what has supposedly happened there. The building is usually described as Tudor, with a tradition that some of the stone in its fabric came from the remains of Evesham Abbey. Down in the cellar, people have reported hearing what sounds like a child crying when no child is present. Others have claimed that furniture has moved without anybody touching it, sometimes violently enough for the activity to be described as poltergeist-like. The stranger stories concern what people believe they have seen in the darkness. Monastic figures have been reported, which perhaps isn't surprising in a town where the memory of the abbey is almost impossible to escape, while other visitors have described children or less recognisable shapes. There are even accounts of red eyes apparently watching from the dark. Those stories have helped make the Spirit House a destination for organised paranormal events, and that means it needs to be treated rather differently from somebody unexpectedly hearing footsteps while locking a shop. Once people enter a dark cellar expecting a ghost, every sound and movement carries a significance it would not have possessed an hour earlier in daylight. That doesn't necessarily mean nothing unusual has happened there. It simply makes separating experience from expectation much harder. Perhaps the most interesting thing about the Spirit House is watching a haunting tradition being created almost in front of us. In another 100 years, if people are still telling stories about a crying child beneath the building, nobody may remember whether the ghost hunts came first, or whether people had been hearing the child for generations. Folklore has a habit of smoothing away those distinctions. Evesham has already had centuries for that process to happen. Its abbey was once the centre of the town, an enormous religious house where monks lived and prayed here, generation after generation. Then came the dissolution in the 16th century, and most of the monastery disappeared. Buildings were pulled apart and useful stone was carried elsewhere. Today the bell tower survives, beside an open space where one of medieval England's great abbeys once stood, and the absence of everything around it somehow makes the tower seem larger. Monks never entirely disappeared from the stories of Evesham either. They turn up as fleeting figures around places associated with the old abbey, and in houses where there is no obvious reason for one to be walking. Perhaps the shadow seen at the dinner party belonged to that tradition. Perhaps it was simply a shadow that happened to resemble the figure the witness expected a medieval monk to have. We cannot know, but there is something strangely appropriate about a monastic ghost walking through a wall in a town where so many of the walls he could have known were dismantled, moved and built into somewhere else. Beyond Evesham itself, the stories become older and considerably stranger. People in the Vale once spoke of something called spot loggins, a name which has survived rather better than any explanation of precisely what spot loggins was. It seems to have been a bogey-like figure, capable of appearing in different forms, and in some tellings, it appeared without a head. There is something appealing about folklore that refuses to explain itself. The people who told these stories apparently didn't need a tragic origin for spot loggins. The name itself was enough. Near Mickleton, a small wood held a rather more particular reputation. People who had to pass it after dark spoke of a sound rather than a sighting, something that carried out from among the trees and had no obvious source. They called it the Mickleton Hooter, and the name itself suggests how the story was passed down, not as a description of something seen, but as an imitation of something heard, repeated by whoever told it next until the sound and the name became the same thing. Nobody, as far as the surviving tradition goes, ever claimed to have found what was making it. What survives instead is the effect it had. Travellers are said to have gone out of their way rather than walk past that wood alone at night, choosing a longer route home over the shorter one that took them within earshot of it. That is, in its way, a more convincing kind of evidence than any sighting would have been. A ghost that appears leaves behind a description, which can be argued over, doubted, dismissed as a trick of the light. A sound that only ever drove people to walk further out of their way leaves behind nothing except the fact that it worked. Whatever the hooter actually was, an owl, a fox, or something rarer, or nothing at all, it achieved something most Vale folklores never quite managed. It changed how people actually moved through the landscape after dark. The roads themselves had stories. Around Littleton, tradition spoke of a phantom coach driven by a headless coachman, while between Western Sub-Edge and Bretforton, another procession was said to travel toward the churchyard. This one was a funeral, moving along the road when no actual burial was taking place. Phantom funerals appear elsewhere in British folklore, and were sometimes regarded as warnings that a genuine death would soon follow. Whatever meaning the procession towards Bretforton once possessed seems to have faded, leaving only the image of mourners travelling towards the churchyard for somebody who had apparently never died. For all these ghosts, creatures, and phantom travellers, the strange thing is that the most obvious source of a haunting around Evesham has produced remarkably little dependable ghost tradition. On the 4th of August 1265, Simon de Montfort and his army were trapped outside the town by forces loyal to Henry III and commanded by Prince Edward. De Montfort realised too late that troops approaching beneath banners he recognised were enemies using standards captured from his son's forces. The battle that followed became a massacre, severe enough for a contemporary chronicler to describe it as the murder of Evesham. De Montfort was killed and his body horribly mutilated. His head was removed, his hands and feet were cut off, and parts of his remains were carried away by his enemies. Hundreds of other men died in the fighting. If ever a place seemed designed to acquire stories of spectral soldiers crossing misty fields, the battle at Evesham should be that place. Such claims do circulate today, particularly around the battlefield and battle well, but nobody telling them today seems to be able to point back to an older witness, a named account, or anything more solid than the reasonable assumption that a battlefield this bloody ought to be haunted. Simon de Montfort certainly acquired a supernatural reputation after his death, but the medieval stories surrounding him concerned alleged miracles at his grave, rather than his ghost wandering the battlefield. There is no reason to force a haunting onto the battle, simply because the history seems to demand one. In fact, the absence makes Evesham more interesting. The great public act of violence that everybody remembers has left surprisingly few substantial ghost stories, while anonymous people in ordinary houses refuse to disappear. We don't know the name of the child beside the fireplace. We don't know who the young woman standing on the bed was. We aren't even certain that George was called George. Yet somehow, these quiet figures have become the ghosts that Evesham has kept. And of all of them, I still find myself returning to the little boy. Perhaps it is because his story contains almost nothing that a ghost story is supposed to contain. The woman wasn't looking for him, and when she saw him, she wasn't frightened. He didn't disappear in front of her or whisper some terrible message. He simply sat beside the fire while a group of adults talked around him, looking poor and rather lonely. For a short while, she accepted him completely. Only later did she ask who he was. Nobody knew. Nobody else had seen him. All that remained was the woman's memory of a child in old clothes, and a peculiar cold place beside the fireplace where she remembered him sitting. Perhaps there is an ordinary explanation for all of it. Perhaps there always was. But somewhere in an old house near Evesham is still a place beside a fire, where the room becomes unexpectedly cold. And if the story is true, there was once a little boy sitting there who seemed entirely unaware that he was supposed to be a ghost. Thank you for listening to Ghost Tales by the Fireside. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider following the podcast on your favourite podcast platform and leave a rating or review. It really does help more people discover the show. You can find more online at ghosttales.co.uk. You can support the podcast and gain access to exclusive content at www.buymeacoffee.com/ghosttales.